Welcome to the Cybersecurity and Cloud Podcast, the podcast where we learn from cybersecurity experts how to stay safe, private, and secure on the cloud and in code. CSCP is hosted by Francesco Cipollone, your cybersecurity friend with a passion for all things cyber and sharing stories of other professionals with you. This episode is brought to you by the generosity of Phoenix Security Limited. Phoenix helps startups and enterprises solve complex software security supply chain visibility by leveraging the power of correlation and contextualization. Discover how Phoenix Security helps CISO and security engineers act fast, prevent burnout, and implement DevSecOps at the speed of cloud. Phoenix Security. Correlate, contextualize, and act on risk with one click. Let's dive in.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Cybersecurity and Cloud Podcast. This is your host, Francesco Cipollone, Frank for Friends. And today we have a friend of ours, a friend of the community of Etsy, that I'd like to discuss a little bit about how he experienced the transformation of the industry from the early days and the transformation of application security program. And that's we touch, and that's how we connect and click. So I have the honor and the pleasure to have Chris Ghigliotty, and I might have butchered the name, so hopefully not, but is the Director of Security Engineering for JustWorks, and previously has been doing application security for several big organizations that we all know about, very engineering focused. So I was really keen to have you on the show. Chris, or Christian, welcome to the show. Tell us a little bit more about you.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, so in my current role overseeing security engineering at JustWorks, previous roles were overseeing engineering functions at Compass, real estate tech company, and also as a practitioner at Etsy. And so I've been in security 8.5 years now. So certainly seen shifts and changes, but it's super interesting time, and happy to be here talking with you about it. So
thank you very much for coming on the show. And maybe on that subject, how did you start in cyber? As one of the questions we tend to ask our practitioner friends.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. For me, I actually didn't start in cyber. I actually thought I was going to be a teacher. I was going to teach English in high school. That was something that I found that I wanted to do. And then when I went to go apply for the program that I, to pursue master's work, I didn't get in. And so I'm like, oh man, what do I do now? So I spent some time working at Apple, and then after Apple, I moved into IT. And once I did that, I started kind of, becoming more aware of security and its importance, and just curious, so like, what is its importance in an enterprise, and how can I get involved? And so it wasn't until I got to Etsy where I was able to actually, really act on that and start to, make contributions and be a part of the community. And then from there, it was really just learning and growing, right? And growing into, a practitioner, and then moving into an engineering manager role, and then now moving into a director role. And so, yeah, and I think that like that experience of kind of coming from, a maybe unconventional background is actually fairly common. And so I think it's just a good thing to always call out, because, we're always, the industry is in need of like people from different places. And I think that it also shows that you can come into the industry, right? Like, you don't have to necessarily be an engineer. Like, you can have other skills and come from other industries and be successful as well.
Actually, on that point, that's a really good point, Christian. And do you feel that you had a particular edge that you could leverage because you have a different background?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me specifically, my goal was to, teach, and I also was passionate about writing. I still am. And so I think that one of the things you often hear is like how you communicate with others, particularly how do you communicate risk, like how do you get buy-in. And I think that served me really well across all my roles, right? Because you need to interface with multiple stakeholders, right? Like, you have to kind of think of like audience oriented communication. And so I think that certainly was an advantage, because I was able to come in and feel very comfortable speaking with people, being able to hopefully articulate a point that landed with everyone. So absolutely, I think that that's a strength for anyone that's coming in that may not be a security engineer or an engineer by trade.
And do you see that as a trend in our industry, that a security professional being deep into the tech world, we tend to have a challenge on communicating with the rest of the business because we tend to be, sorry for the stereotype, the geeky person with a hoodie on that sits in front of numbers and numbers crunching. And then when we get to the human interaction, we say bunch of technical stuff and we confuse the hell out of business people.
Yeah, I've definitely met a lot of really good security engineers that know how to communicate. So, I would say that I think it's just always important to, keep that top of mind that like, as you, are thinking through risk and thinking through solutions, right? Because like we want to, be like solutions oriented in our roles. We want to think about like how we can provide or enable others. It's always important to think about how you're going to communicate that, right? How are you going to tell and share the value of your work? And so I think that any time you can carve out the time to include that as part of the work, like, yes, you have the technical solution. Yes, you have, the code or the tool that's going to, ultimately land that. But, how are you going to deliver that? How is that going to be shared? I think is like invaluable.
That's a really important point. Telling the story around data, around risk. I think we are massively lacking that expertise or that ability to storytelling. Do you see that as one of the trends in our industry? What's in your opinion the state of the industry right now?
Well, I certainly think that the narrative, you need to control the narrative about your program and the work that your team does. And I think that's really important. In my current role and in my previous role, that was definitely something that, we, as a management team, we're constantly thinking about because, you want to be able to show the value of your work and also be able to educate others and bring them into the conversation. And so sometimes that involves offering up a taxonomy or a language that you both can kind of engage with. And so I do think that's really important. And so as a program is being built, thinking about how are you going to share that with the appropriate audiences, whether that's management, whether that's developers, whoever your customers are, like we need to, to do that. And I think that becomes incredibly important, especially as now, you hear a lot about value and costs and like how are we going to make sure that we're efficient, right? You can do that by controlling the narrative and having a good narrative around like how you're delivering value, how you're doing that. And especially around security engineering, right, where you're building solutions, you're building tools, you're enabling customers of various kinds, that's where you can then showcase that value. And especially when we're thinking about, hey, like where are the redundancies like with respect to tools, right? Or like, hey, where are the redundancies with respect to X or Y? I think that's going to be a continued theme you're going to see. Like, how can we become more efficient? How can we become better at these things?
Right. But before becoming efficient, I would like to ask you a question. How do you start an application security program? Because you can't bring efficiency if you don't have anything in place, right?
No, that's true. I think I think in order to, first and foremost, you need to understand, what the current state is, but also how, those interactions, with customers and who you're going to ultimately be serving is really important. I also think that, understanding what the needs of the company are going to be, because, maybe you want to start an application security program, but is that the right thing to do at the moment, right? Does that make sense to pursue now versus something else? But let's assume that that is the case, right? And we want to make sure that we are writing secure software, that developers feel supported and enabled, that we are enabling the business to continue to grow lines of business. I think, kind of understanding where developers are operating, understanding, what people are using, understanding how, processes and within the engineering organization function. So then you can start to make investments or think about investments. So we're actually we went some of that. We've been doing some of that now in our planning, where we're thinking about what are the investment areas. And during the planning phase, I was very much like, let's use the word investments, because I want to just make sure I want people to kind of get into this habit of thinking about an investment as like a long-term bet, right? So we're making an investment here, and a collection of these investments ultimately like form a strategy that's going to, better support the team and better support the business. So I think like having a keen understanding of those things like helps to start building that program.
I really, really like the investment approach, because application security tend to be long hold it's like you own a stock, you own a very long hold stock. And in order to see the benefit, you have to put a lot of groundwork to train the security engineers. There is some tactical element that you can do and some immediate metrics. And maybe you want to touch on that aspect that you can bring to show really immediate value. But it's a really long-term building of relationship, of training. Would you link as well a return on investment on that investment?
Yeah, I mean, I think this goes back to the narrative, right? It's like, I think if you talk about these investments and then you're able to then, tie them to a long, and ultimately, tell the story of that long-term strategy, you can then start to then measure those investments and then say like, here the reduction in X, here's the increase in Y, whatever those metrics are, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I think ultimately, like, you do have to at some point show what the ROI is going to be on those investments, right? If we're really going to use that investment analogy. And I do think that you can do that. And so, part of it is going to be, identifying those investment areas. And then part of it is being able to make sure you're selling that, correctly to people, because they will ask like, okay, great. Like, this is an investment area, but show me how this is going to make, support developers in writing secure software. How is this going to reduce our risk in these areas? So,
right, because no business-wise person will say, I don't care about security, or maybe they will say security is taken care of. But what that practically means, and from, care about security on you're going to invest X amount of development time on actually fixing everything, there is a huge leap of investment. So on that point, there is a lot of discussion about, for example, security champion program, or in general activities that are possibly difficult to measure in terms of investments and in terms of return on investment. What metrics would you use to actually evidence or maybe link to the effectiveness of a security program?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, actually, I was having this discussion recently where we were talking about, developer, like being able to give developers training. And I think this is like a really point that a lot of people kind of discuss in their programs. It's like, we want to be able to scale the program, right? Mm-hmm. And we know we're never going to have 200 security engineers on a team. So how can we scale the program? We can do that with some tooling, but the other part of it is how can we empower people to make security decisions, right? So we talk about like context and giving people like enough context to make those decisions, right? So that's one way we can do it. But we were having this discussion recently around like what are the outcomes, right, for developer training? And so, I don't want it to be a sort of checkbox exercise. And so thinking about like identifying the outcomes, right? So what are the outcomes if we decide to give everyone threat model training as an example, right? Like, if everyone gets threat model training, how can we then, like, what are the outcomes from that? And then from there, like, how can we then make that part of, their ideation and their development, such that maybe we can start to identify like, the ways in which they're actually doing it in practice. And then we can say, okay, here's the actual outcome, because by adding it as part of their development ideation phases, we've seen, some of these, some of the designs that come to us are better, right? Or like they've thought about these controls and things, right? So, that's sort of like that's one of the more recent examples that I've been thinking about of like, how can we, take that outcome and then be able to inject it back into that process, so then we can measure the process better. Security champions is interesting because I think that it sounds great on paper, but I just don't know. It sounds great on paper, but I also don't know if there's an easy way to kind of measure that at all. But also too, I think that there's probably other more like high leverage activities that you would like. I would much prefer to kind of think through like developer training a little bit more thoughtfully than that, because with security champions, like there's, you have to also be very careful and thoughtful about like what you're asking those people to take on. And I think that you might be able to lead into relationships a little bit more, give people like guidance on like testing practices, or like build tooling for them, or other things that might be more high leverage, right? And that could still have the same outcomes.
This episode is brought to you by the generosity of Phoenix Security Limited. Phoenix helps startups and enterprises solve complex software security supply chain visibility by leveraging the power of correlation and contextualization. Phoenix platform connects to your repositories, scanners, and cloud, correlates all the information, and provides you with a prioritized list of vulnerabilities that need to be addressed first. Discover how Phoenix Security helps CISOs and developers remove friction and maximize the use of DevSecOps professionals at phoenix.security. Phoenix Security. Correlate, contextualize, and act on risk with one click.
I like the way you're taking this to actually express impact on security development time and how you can be impactful. But there is another important point that you really touched on that is very close to my heart. That is, how do you empower developer to actually spend time on this, on fixing security stuff? Because you can, like, if you take the security champion, if you take the training, you can spend X amount of hours. But if their objective and their OKR are linked to send code as quickly as possible, that's not a culture of security. They will never be empowered with all the training in the world to actually go and fix security or upgrade or spend cycles on security, even in test threat modeling. So how do we get the business buy-in to actually practically have metrics that encourage developer to actually do security and to be rewarded for doing security? That is not just a nice mascot or a sticker or like something more practical and something that they will feel proud when they're doing their annual review or their performance review. Yeah, you've done a lot of security stuff in here.
Yeah, actually, I was having a discussion with a peer who actually worked at Amazon, and she shared with me that like that's actually a metric that's part of performance and things like that, which I found interesting. I haven't worked at a place that's done that yet, but going back to kind of making people feel empowered and caring about this, and I think that really initially is like the work of the security team itself to first be introspective. I think like looking at let's just assume that we do have the data to kind of start digging into and understanding like where we're seeing these vulnerabilities, and whether that's through your SaaS or DaaS tooling. Maybe you're cutting Jira tickets and developers are fixing things. I think kind of understanding like the teams that are, the teams where like that they do have to go and make those changes because maybe either they were found as a result of a penetration test or like it was a finding in your scanner, and kind of understanding like which teams are doing that a lot, and then kind of engaging with them and starting to build relationships and say like, hey, we see an opportunity to, either, spend some time with you and threat model more, or maybe there's a wrapper we can build, or maybe there's a process we can put in place to bring awareness to this, right? Or maybe it's asking them very directly, like, what's your comfort level with these things, right? And I think that really it really leads into the thing that we talk about a lot in the industry, is just building those relationships with people, right? As an example,
those are meaningful relationships. Like what you're describing, a meaningful relationship, they're not like, how can we help? But we've seen these trends, like coming to a meeting with already data and context about those development cycle and saying, we've seen a trending of you making the same issue around, I don't know, authentication. Let's focus maybe a couple of cycle on authentication, or maybe let's develop together a library to interface with our identity provider, or I don't know, input validation might be an issue. And I'm talking from my experience, by looking at trending, you get invited more into the sprint, into the retrospective, because you bring value. You're not a blocker. You bring that level of insight that is not generic. Like, here's a training, go and train on stuff. And maybe the issue that you're making is input validation and you're getting trained on XSS. That's similar, but, it's not really targeting the pain. It's not really having the maximum return on investment on the impact that you can have on developer.
Right.
I sound like a broker.
Listen, I think you're doing a good job of exactly selling what we want, right? I mean, I think that that same peer that I had mentioned, right? We were talking about, she was asking about like my roadmap and like what I was thinking about in terms of like how we can support, secure software development internally. And, my program is still very nascent. It's for, I've been here for 4 months. And so we're just building out, like fundamental pieces. And one of those things is really kind of leaning into a like more formal threat model practice. And she was like, I would love to be able to partner with you and like bring that practice to my team first. And let's be an early adopter of like really doing that in a way that is repeatable and we can do it long term and it becomes a muscle that we can strengthen. And so, and that's what I mean. I think we need to like, any program early days, you need to do that work. You need to be able to kind of form those relationships and those partnerships and do that. And then from there, like you can start to socialize, you can point back to successes. And even as to your point before around kind of those, you not being generic, right? When you come with data, when you come with like, hey, like over the past quarter, like we've seen like these amount of findings, right? Or we've, through, a year's worth of penetration tests, we found that the feature that, you currently own is susceptible to these things. Like, let's talk about like how we can make improvements or like what we can build together to do that. And I think that just goes such a long way because you're bringing data to that discussion as well.
Yeah. And I really like that approach because you're not only bringing data, but you bring in proposition. So you're not saying you shall fix this issue with SLA X, Y, and Z. That unfortunately, all our regulators are pushing that kind of narrative and is, I think, detrimental to the relationship that we're trying to build with developers. But also, you bring in value already to a conversation that otherwise will be stifled by metrics that are not really fostering relationship and fostering impact.
Yeah. And I think also, I mean, there needs to be, of course, a willingness with the other team to engage in that. But, I think that's where the security team can come in and, first and foremost, like be empathetic with them because like these teams are having to build software and ship it fast. First and foremost, being empathetic and just kind of understanding what their challenges are. And I think once you do that, you can start to bring solutions that, are appropriate for those teams, right? Because that's the other thing too, is that the needs of that team versus others are going to be different. So I think being aware of that, and then you can have those successes, and then again you can point back to them, and then that becomes the fuel for the buy-in for the rest of the other teams or the rest of the org, etc.
I agree, but there is an important factor that you kind of highlighted that is the buy-in or the business buy-in on actually fixing stuff. They need to be free and able to actually do this exercise and sit on sprint planning before even doing anything. So having those OKR and those metrics and to actually authorize them to even talk to security, to spend time with security, I think is important. What would be a set of metrics that you would throw at a product team instead of a security team?
That's a good question. I think in terms of, what I would be, I'm always interested in adoption metrics. I think that's really interesting to me because I want to know, if we're talking about a feature, like how widely it's used, because then I think that like that becomes an interesting launching pad into like how it might be abused. So if we're getting wide adoption of something, I'd like to know that because then that might be something we want to look at. I also am really also interested in learning about sort of churn and friction with something, right? Because I think from there too, like I wonder if there's opportunities for security to support a product in that, and make it easier. Like, let's just say a customer is like, oh, I'm not using the product because of these reasons, right? Are they not using it because the product is introduces a lot of friction? Is it because of security? Is there a security control or something that's causing that? Whatever it is, but I think that that's also interesting, and I think it also could be an opportunity for security to help enable if it makes sense. So that's another metric that I'd like to kind of dig into, like as a product metric. And then I also think, if we're talking about like a security impacting feature, how often are people using it, how people are, if people are disabling it, right? Because I think from there, then we kind of start to think about like, what's that user experience? It forces us to be more user-centric. And those are all things that we're kind of talking about, now, and I think we've talked about previously as well. So
security feature and applying product metrics to security feature. It's an interesting It's an interesting angle. But
Yeah, I mean,
isn't security always frictionful? Like if you think about it, like aside like HTTPS, aside few things that have become the norm, like even MFA is
mhm.
frictionful. Offering it is becoming the norm, but a lot of steps that we traditionally put together, like role-based access control or few things, are not gonna remove friction, are gonna add friction. So where is the balance of security versus usability?
Yeah, I would say that we should always be thinking about it in terms of experiences. So,
Mm-hmm.
you are correct that there is some friction as a result of like an MFA prompt or of a password requirement. But I think there's opportunities there to generate or create like a user experience that makes people understand its value and understand why they're being asked to do something. And I think that's where the value is, right? So it could be something as simple as a banner, or it could show even a password. Like there was some really great articles from Segment, that talk about like the creation of like the password of a password strength meter on there. And like you'd be surprised that these like very like small visual elements like make people feel like, okay, like maybe I'm doing something that's good, right? Or like maybe I'm being, nudged in a direction that might help me secure my account or do something, right? But I think like that's where the value we can provide value
Mm-hmm.
is by trying to think about experiences. And then if we can at least provide a positive experience for people, then maybe that friction like is fine, and we can accept that because the user knows, okay, by doing this, like I'm doing a positive behavior, or like I'm adding security to my current context, whatever that is. So, and I think that's where we can provide that value.
You make me think about something else now, to actually use security as a feature and as a differentiator, actually, to actually bring in a product in the forefront. Have you seen that as a different narrative or different way to flip it into a product? Instead of saying, you shall do this as a product, you can say, we can be this most secure product in the marketplace because we have X, Y, and Z feature.
I mean, I think that just the security features as a product differentiator is like something that I think I mean, it's certainly been in discussions that I've, on the teams that I've bid on. And so it becomes like this trust assurance, right? Like the
Mm-hmm.
customer that's coming to the product like feels like they can put their trust in it because of that. And so I think it makes sense to try to, give customers as many trust assurance as possible. And that can come in many forms. I mean, I know we talked about kind of the user experience, right? But maybe that also comes in, the form of, how you communicate, the security of the product to the customer, right? I think staying away from being like, well, we're the most secure product in all the world, so like you should use it, right? But I
I'm
do
being
think
fictitious.
no,
I'm
I
being
know, of course.
fictitious on purpose.
No, I know. But of course, I think that also comes back to something we touched on very early is the narrative, right? It's like what is the narrative around the work that the security team is doing? How is that visible? How does that help to communicate a trust assurance to someone that is looking at several products and wants to make a decision on that, right? So I think that's where, your experiences that you create, the narrative that you create, like do that like automatically.
Brilliant. Unfortunately, we're coming close to the end of the podcast, and we have a tradition, Christian, here on leaving everybody with a warm and fuzzy feeling. So we have a tradition on the podcast that is closing with a positive message. What will be your take in all the discussion that we had on a positive close?
The industry is really an interesting space to be in. I think if you're curious, I think if you want to be in an industry that is going to, really kind of give you exposure to challenges that really kind of, are, impact not only corporations, but clearly is now, impacting, government and a number of other places. Like this is a really great industry to be in. And I also think just to keep top of mind that it is challenging because there's so many things you could be involved in, but don't let that stop you from trying to be a part of it. And I think that there's a lot of welcoming people in this industry that will support you. That was certainly the case with me. And I think that we should always just make sure that we empower people to come into this industry and make an impact and to grow and to really just, change the industry and their own lives as well. So, and I'm looking forward to the next 30, 40 years of it.
Wave of new generation of security folks. Brilliant.
Yep.
Christian, if people want to see more of you, what you write, what you talk about, where they can find you?
I'm on LinkedIn, so you can find me on LinkedIn, of course. I'm on Twitter as well. Harvey Wells on Twitter. You can find me on LinkedIn as well as you like. And, I would say, check me out there.
Brilliant. If you haven't considered starting in cyber, if you have friends that haven't considered starting in cyber, this is your clue and input to go and evangelize and maybe bring another person from a left field into the security space, because we definitely need you, and we are welcoming bunch of folks, even though a little bit crazy about certain aspects of security. We are
passionate.
Good people.
They're not crazy. They're passionate.
Absolutely. Christian, thank you very much for coming on the show. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you about application security. And everybody, stay safe out there and involve as many people as you can. Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode. Please leave us a review on Apple Podcast and post it on social media tagging Cybersecurity Cloud Podcast for a chance to win a $100 Amazon gift card. Discover other episodes at www.cybersecuritypodcast.com.